Whammy bar resistance test, string tension versus spring tension. In a previous video, I changed the gauge of string on this guitar from gauge 10 to gauge 9 because I wanted to make the whammy bar easier to push down. Now, I thought that I had made that whammy bar easier to push down, but now I'm thinking it's just because the guitar was a bit easier to play with the lighter strings, and the result I wanted was that I wanted it to be easier to push down. I think that my brain just sort of played a trick on me and made me believe that I had the result I wanted. So I really need to know for sure. So what I've got here is a bunch of different string gauges. I have a bunch of different spring tensions. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep the string gauge the same, change the spring tension, see what difference it makes by actually measuring the force it takes to push the whammy bar down. And then I'm going to keep the same springs on and try changing the string gauge, and again measure that again and see what difference that makes on the amount of force required to push the whammy bar down. So hopefully by the end of this video I'll know if I want to change the resistance of my whammy bar, what makes the biggest difference? Is it the springs? Is it the strings? Is it a bit of both? Is it kind of more one than the other? I don't know. I really want to know. So let's find out. For this test, I gaffer taped a yoga block to some bathroom scales to measure the force required to fully depress the whammy bar. The yoga block was just there to protect my guitar from getting scratched. I made some marks on the yoga block to make sure the guitar was in the same position for each test. I made sure to push the whammy bar down to the same point on the guitar body each time. I made sure to press the whammy bar down from the same point, i.e. the end of the whammy bar, with the same thumb each time. I've got a really sore thumb. I took each measurement 3 times, then took an average to account for any variation in the readings. I made sure to tune the guitar to concert pitch and level the trem after each string or spring change. I tested all workable combinations of the following strings: Ernie ball, super slinky 9 to 42s, Ernie ball, regular slinky 10 to 46, Ernie ball, power slinky 11 to 48, and I tested the following springs: stock Floyd Rose springs that came with my guitar, FU tone silent springs standard, FU tone silent springs light, FU tone silent springs heavy, and FU tone silent springs super heavy. The guitar and the yoga block combined weigh 3.9 kilos, so I have to deduct that from all of my readings. So here is all the data I collected. When I had 9 to 42 strings on the guitar, I could use all of the springs that I had available in my test. The 3 times stock Floyd Rose springs, the 3 times super heavy springs, the 3 times heavy springs, 3 times light springs, 3 times standard springs, and I also went to 2 springs as well. I tried 2 of the super heavy springs and 2 of the heavy springs. I collected all this information, which we'll go into in a second. When I had 10 to 46 strings on the guitar, I only had 2 spring tensions available to me: the 3 times heavy springs and the 3 times super heavy springs. I tried 3 times light and 3 times standard springs, but I didn't have enough tension. I didn't bother testing 2 springs, and I didn't test the stock Floyd Rose springs, as there's not something we can buy again. I don't really know which springs they are. They're just the springs that came with my guitar. When I had 11 to 48 strings on the guitar, I had the same 2 spring tensions available to me: the 3 times heavy springs and the 3 times super heavy springs. I didn't test the stock Floyd Rose, and all the other springs were too weak. I didn't bother trying 2 springs because that would also be too weak. So looking at the 9 to 42 string set in more detail, my original 3 times stock Floyd Rose springs required 5 kilos of pressure to fully depress the whammy bar. 3 of the heavy springs required 4.9 kilos of pressure, which is 0.1 kilo or 2% less than the stock Floyd Rose springs. 3 of the super heavy springs required 4.8 kilos of pressure, which is 0.2 kilos or 4% less. The 3 times light springs required 4.65 kilos of pressure, which is 0.35 or 7% less than the stock Floyd Roses. 3 times standard springs required 4.5 kilos of pressure, which is 0.5 kilos or 10% less. Then I started testing 2 springs. The only springs I could get to work as a set of 2 were the heavy and the super heavy springs, and I got the same reading of 4.15 kilos resistance required for both of them, which is 0.85 kilos or 17% less than 3 of the stock Floyd Rose springs. I decided to to use the 2 heavy springs on my guitar, set it up, I played it for a bit and it seemed okay, but when I came back to the guitar a few days later, it was completely out of tune. I tuned it up and I saw that my trem plate was raised up quite high. So there are 3 things that could have caused this: an extreme increase in neck relief, an increase in string tension, or a decrease in spring tension. So what caused it? The guitar was in tune when I left it, the nut was locked, the trem was level, my neck relief hadn't changed. The strings were tuned to standard tuning, so the string tension hadn't changed, so the only possibility is a change in spring tension. I had not adjusted the trem claw screws, and they certainly didn't change on their own, so I can only conclude that the springs stretched. I didn't have enough adjustment left in the trem claw screws, so I changed the springs from 2 times heavy springs to 2 times super heavy springs. I leveled the trem, I played the guitar with heavy whammy bar use and checked it over a period of 3 days. The trem was still level, so I'm confident that 2 of the super heavy springs will do the job. So this has taken the whammy bar resistance down from 5 kilos with the stock Floyd Rose springs to 4.15 kilos with the 2 FU tone super heavy springs. So that's a reduction of 0.85 kilos or 17% compared to 3 of the stock Floyd Rose springs. Looking at the 10 to 46 string set in more detail, the 3 heavy springs required 5.5 kilos of pressure and 3 super heavy springs required 5.65 kilos of pressure, which is 0.1 kilo or 1.8% more than the heavy springs. So changing the spring tension with 10 to 46 strings made a minimal difference. Looking at the 11 to 48 string set in more detail, the 3 times heavy springs required 5.73 kilos of pressure and the 3 times super heavy springs required 6.21 kilos of pressure, which is 0.48 kilos or 8.37% more than the heavy springs. So changing spring tension with 11 to 48 strings made an 8.37% difference compared to a 1.8% difference with 10 to 46 strings. So changing spring tension appears to make a greater difference with heavier strings. Now let's look at the heavy springs with various string gauges. So 9 to 42 strings required 4.9 kilos of pressure. 10 to 46 strings required 5.5 kilos of pressure, which is 0.06 or 12.24% more compared to the gauge 9 strings. And 11 to 48 strings required 5.73 kilos of pressure, which is 0.83 or 16.93% more than the 9 to 42 strings. So we can see that changing the string gauge makes a bigger difference to whammy bar resistance than just changing the spring tension. Looking at the super heavy springs in detail with different string gauges, 9 to 42 strings required 4.8 kilos of pressure, 10 to 46 strings required 5.65 kilos of pressure, which is 0.85 kilos or 17.7% more than the same springs with the 9 to 42 strings on the guitar. 11 to 48 strings required 6.21 kilos of pressure, which is 1.41 kilos or 29.37% more than the 9 to 42 strings. So changing string gauge with heavy springs makes the biggest difference of all. These are the largest percentages seen in our test. So let's try to make sense of all those numbers. What makes the biggest difference? Spring tension or string tension? When we changed spring tension with a 9 to 42 strings using 3 springs, it made a slight difference each time. So 2%, another 2%, 3%, another 3%, totaling 10% difference going from the stock Floyd Rose springs, 3 of them, to 3 of the standard springs. Changing the number of springs made a bigger difference. 3 times super heavy springs was 4% lighter than the stock Floyds. 2 times super heavy springs was 17% lighter. So in this case, removing a spring made the whammy bar 13% lighter to push down compared to 3 of the same spring type. If we look at the difference it makes when you change string gauge, it seems to make a bigger difference than keeping the number of springs the same and changing spring tension. So using heavy springs, going from 9s to 10s, made the whammy bar 12.24% harder to push down, and going from 10 to 11s made it 4.69% harder again, totaling 16.93%. Using super heavy springs, going from 9s to 10s made the whammy bar 17.7% harder to push down, and going from 10s to 11s made it 12.3% harder again, totaling 29.37% if we compare the difference between 9s and 11s. This makes it clear to me that changing string gauge has a much greater effect effect on whammy bar resistance than changing spring tension. Going from 9s to 10s makes a bigger difference than going from 10s to 11s. So if you want a light feeling whammy bar, it seems that 9s are the best option. We can go lighter if you prefer, but I didn't try any lighter strings. So in summary, changing the string gauge makes the biggest difference to whammy bar resistance, followed by adding or removing a spring, and the thing that makes the least amount of difference is changing the actual tension of the springs, i.e. going from light to heavy springs. Changing spring tension makes more of a difference with heavier strings than it does with lighter strings. Changing string gauge makes more of a difference with heavier springs than it does with lighter springs. So if you want to make a subtle difference to whammy bar resistance, try changing the springs to a different tension. If you want to make a bigger difference, try adding or removing springs. If you want to make a bigger difference still, try changing the string gauge. And of course, you can try any of these things in combination. I can feel it. Yeah, it's lighter, it's easier to push down. It's just more fun, basically. I'm not fighting against it like I was before. So was it worth it? Yeah, I got a sore thumb from pushing down that whammy bar, but that will go away after a couple of days. And I learned something, so I hope you learned something too. And please let me know in the comments what you thought. If you've got any other ideas about whammy bars, about spring tension, about string tension. We didn't talk about alternate tunings. We didn't talk about angling the springs. So if you've got any thoughts on all that stuff, please share it in the comments. Just share your knowledge. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, please subscribe.